What if I told you that some scientists are saying that there's only 60 cropping cycles left on planet Earth? I've been talking a little bit about this recently, and there's a few facts that exist underneath this piece of information. Some people are saying this isn't true. This was an article in Scientific American. And from my perspective, I've been in agriculture for quite a while now. And the average ton of grain produced in North America produces or generates 7 tons of soil erosion. So we're actually eroding more soil than we are producing grain right now. And we reached peak grain output in 1986 per capita. Most people don't know that either. And there's roughly 18 months of food on planet Earth at any given time. So I want you to remember those facts because we're going to talk about them a little bit later. But basically, our current agricultural system is very fragile. And when we think about civilization, civilization basically is built on top of agriculture and finance. And so we've created a very, very shaky foundation for ourselves, and we need to start thinking about what we're going to do. And I think it's worth looking at this 60 crop cycle a little bit closer, because for the first time in my life, about a year ago, I was listening to a podcast from a scientist who is talking about the fact that we're probably going to see the first gigafamine. I've never heard that word before. We hear Elon using the word giga all the time. But a gigafamine would be more than 1 billion people starving on planet Earth simultaneously. It's a pretty stark fact to start thinking about, especially if you've got children. I've got 2 of them, and I think about that all the time. And we've known this for a long time. Roosevelt said that a nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. This is many, many years ago now, and we're still having this conversation today, and things are not really changing quick enough. In addition to us losing massive amounts of soil, if we look back in time, we can see that disease rates have definitely gone up from the past. And so this is some disease rates from present day in the United States. So autism, 1 in 36, ADD, 1 in 10, asthma, 1 in 10, allergies. Most people have allergies these days. Even dementia, the statistics on dementia is absolutely staggering. And by the time I'm in my 70s, they're saying now that 1 in 1 people, basically everybody, is going to end up with dementia by the time that they get towards their death. And we can see that disease hasn't just been growing, but it's continuing to grow. And so of the population 50 years and older, the number with at least 1 chronic disease is estimated to increase by 99.5%. 71.5 million in 2020 to 142 million by 2050. And so something is not working. And so while disease is growing logarithmically, nutrients are collapsing. And so let's see if I can get a laser pointer here. This is documented in many books. There's something online that you can look up. A quick Google search will find something called the Great Nutrient Collapse. And so there's several reasons that this is occurring, one of which is actually very counterintuitive. So as the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes up, plants are actually becoming more carbohydrate rich because CO2 is a fertilizer, and it's creating a dilution effect. But that dilution effect also occurs as a result of phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium, the synthetic versions of it, which we can see are also increasing. And so on one hand, we've got trends going down to the right, and on the other hand, we have trends going up into the right. And some of this is going to be anecdotal and won't necessarily be correlated. But I think that a short literature review will indicate that a lot of our diseases are actually directly related to the nutrient density of our food. And if you're interested in that, like I said, Google is your friend. You can find lots of data on this. In addition to this, our mental well-being is declining. And if you've recently watched The Social Dilemma, I mean, part of it is going to be social media induced. But I also believe that a lot of our mental well-being has to do with the nutrition in our food and how we're currently existing on this planet. And so some are referring to this as the polycrisis or the metacrisis. And I'm not saying that agriculture informs the entire metacrisis or polycrisis, but the polycrisis itself is an aggregate of crises that we are facing as a civilization. What I am saying, though, is that agriculture does form the basis of civilization. And if we cannot figure out how to coexist on this planet, we're heading in a direction that we may not want to be going. And so I have this funny thing that I do. I love this quote, actually. Insanity is the same thing, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And so literally, we're just hitting ourselves on the head right now with a bat. And the way that we solve our problems in this world is I just take a Tylenol. That's not strong enough. I still have a headache. And so then I need a Tylenol 3, and then I'm going to end up with stronger and stronger drugs when I just have to stop hitting my head. And so we really have to get to the root cause of the issue if we want to actually solve this problem. And so my name is Rob Avis, and my colleague here is Marc. I live on a farm in Alberta, which is the Texas of the North. And I've been in agriculture for the last 15 years. I teach permaculture design. I consult for farmers right across North America. And we have recently started Fifth World. And our mission is planetary regeneration within a generation. And I'm going to let Marc introduce himself, and then I'm going to do half the presentation, then Marc's going to finish off with the other half.
Hey, everyone. Oops. So my name is Marc. I am the most handsome co-CEO. I'm joking. But jokes aside, I'm an electrical and computer engineer. I started my career working in smart grids, renewable energy, and smart cities, mostly in the GCC region. And then I moved to New York at some point to do my MBA, really, at Columbia Business School. But interestingly enough, I ended up in the blockchain space. I joined a company called Consensus, which was a startup back then, and is now one of the leading companies in blockchain. And then a lot of my work has been focused on thinking through how to build crypto-economic incentive systems and decentralized governance and coordination. We'll be talking about some of this later, and I'll be back with more.
Thanks, Marc. So I actually started my career in the oil and gas industry. I'm a mechanical engineer, and I was the guy that would bring gas to your homes. Well, I didn't actually bring it to your home, but I brought it to the facility that processed it so it could go to your home and you could keep your house warm. And I got really disenfranchised with the industry because on one hand, I was responsible for cutting down massive swaths of forest in order to bring these pipelines through. But at the same time, I was a consumer. And so how could I criticize the very industry that I was supporting as a consumer? And it really created a lot of conflict inside of my head. And I received this 3-minute video while I was getting ready to cut down a massive swath of forest from a gentleman in Australia, actually. And he was describing an ecosystem that he had created almost out of thin air in the Dead Sea Valley, lowest place on Earth, hypersaline soils. And I started thinking to myself, what am I going to spend the rest of my life doing? Clearly, I can see there's all these problems in the world. Do I want to maintain status quo? Do I want to use my life energy to maintain status quo? Or do I want to actually try and move the needle a little bit on this planet? And I'm a nerd. I took out my calculator and I calculated the average person has about 600,000 hours of life energy. And I'd burned through about a third of them. And shortly thereafter, my wife and I quit our jobs. We traveled around the world. And we started seeing some really interesting patterns because wherever we went, we found different narratives. So in Calgary, the narrative was all oil and gas is going to be what we use forever. In Denmark, they were already well on their transition towards renewable energy. So very different story, completely conflicting to what I was learning about in Calgary. And then in Mexico, they had a whole different kind of culture around food. We traveled there for a while in our Volkswagen that was powered on canola oil, waste canola oil. And so we spent literally 3 years kind of traveling all around the world collecting stories of good news, as opposed to all the bad news that keeps getting permeated through Web 2, social media, newspapers, television, etc. And what we realized was that the issues that we face as a society are not technical in nature. We actually know how to solve most of these problems. but it was social. And so as we started to collect these models of hope, these models of good news, we then started a company, we started teaching, and we've taught thousands of people across the world right now who are taking these individual little bits of good news and these ideas, and they're applying them at their home. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why Regen Ag is important and where we think it needs to go. So we're not going to talk about things like Kiss the Ground. And if you haven't seen this movie, how many people have seen Kiss the Ground? Okay, highly recommend you go watch this movie. There's a couple of videos like this. The Biggest Little Farm is another one that's kind of similar in nature. They're good news stories about how Regen Ag has the ability to literally transform the world, but we're not going to talk about that today. We're not going to talk about proving regenerative agriculture. It's already proven. There's lots of data that shows that this is a very, very hopeful thing for humanity to be doing. And we're not going to talk about all the intricacies of Regen Ag, but we are going to talk about something new. And so, first of all, if you've never heard of the word Regen Ag, I want to just kind of give you a bit of a primer on this, and then we're going to move into that new piece here shortly. And so degenerative agriculture, I would refer to as the conventional agricultural system. Now, I want to be really clear here. I'm not trying to create divisiveness. We all depend upon conventional agriculture or industrial agriculture right now, and I'm very thankful that people are continuing to do this because we'd be in a giga-famine if we weren't. I also don't think that the problems that we're seeing as a result of industrial ag are the fault of the farmers. I think we've asked individuals to go out and grow food at the lowest possible marginal cost that they can do with the existing technology stack that they've got. And this is what we're getting. And we as consumers, if we're buying food from any of these systems, are driving the system as much as everybody else. It's a complex system. And so I'm not trying to create divisiveness between cohorts and groups here. However, if we look at agriculture over the last 10,000 years, we can see a really interesting pattern, and that is that it has followed a pattern of deforestation, plowing, and desertifying. And every time we desertified as a species, we ended up leaving and going somewhere else because we couldn't grow anything there. But the thing is that for literally the last 9,900 or 9,800 years of our existence in this paradigm, we haven't had fast enough feedback to be able to understand the consequences of our actions. So a lot of people will say, what's Regen Ag? Regen Ag is what we were doing 300 years ago. Well, not really, because agriculture has essentially deforested 50% of the trees on planet Earth. So we have to look at long history to understand kind of where we've come from. We now have the technology to be able to understand the consequences of the decisions that we're making, and so we can start making better decisions with that technology. But in general, Regen Ag competes with nature, okay? And we're gonna come back to this in a second. It disturbs soil, so that means that it rototills. It literally, our tractors are kind of like Vitamixes that go and they just turn up the soil and they destroy the life that lives in there. They're based on monoculture, which means that they utilize one type of plant in a field. And this is really an effort to try and make agriculture more efficient because our machines are basically big, powerful, dumb machines, dumb in that they do one thing. And so they need their fields to mimic that type of machine that they're going to be using to try and get that marginal cost of food production down. And they're ultimately reductionist in approach, meaning that when we have one problem, we try and create one solution, as opposed to trying to understand the root cause of why that problem was there. And you can see that in our vernacular. So the word pest, for example, is just a bug that we don't want there because it's competing with the goals of our system. Or a weed. There are no weeds in nature. There's just plants that have specific functions. And so nature has no sentiment. We apply sentiment into these systems, and we don't take the time to understand why that plant is there and what it's actually doing as far as the system is concerned. If you think about, it's really interesting for me in the climate change space how people will come in and talk about invasive weeds, right? And so invasive weeds are weeds that come in, they're aggressive, they try and take over a system, and so people get really angry about that. But if you actually believe that the climate is changing, Does it make sense for us to try and keep our ecosystem static? Or is nature trying to evolve with the changing of the climate? And maybe we should be paying attention to these new species that are showing up. And if we look back in history, we can see the beechwood forests of Europe actually moved hundreds of kilometers north and south, depending upon how the climate was changing, because the earth was adapting, because it's an adaptive system. And so agriculture attempts to keep everything static and stationary in time, because that's what our goal set is. But if we don't understand how the systems need to adapt and how adaptive systems work, we're going to end up going extinct. And so regenerative is a completely different paradigm in that it partners with nature. So when we look at building a regenerative system, we ask ourselves, what does this ecosystem tend towards naturally? So we say in permaculture, work is a failure in design. So if you're always having to add energy into the system to try and keep it in a specific pattern, what you're doing is you're fighting against the natural tendency of nature. And so if we can understand what nature wants to be and partner with it, we remove effort and work. It protects and enhances the soil. It focuses on diversity of annual and perennial plants, and it integrates livestock systems and generally has a more holistic approach in producing food. This doesn't mean a sacrifice of yield. In fact, sometimes you can get yield improvements, and at the very least you get profit improvements because the amount of inputs that you require in these systems is lower. And so we can kind of think about agriculture through the lens of decentralization right now. And this is kind of a hot topic in our society as we move towards blockchain currencies like Bitcoin. But the conventional industrial system is very much centralized. And so your farmers get all of their seeds and inputs from one supplier, or maybe one of three. All of their food goes into a very small number of purchasers, essentially, so the commodities market. And so farmers don't have a lot of options with regards to where they buy their inputs and where they sell their inputs. Now, when we move towards regenerative agriculture, it tends to be a little bit more decentralized, because now they're not necessarily buying fertilizer inputs, they're actually generating them on property through integrating livestock by using different crops. And generally, regen ag farmers, especially kind of the medium to smaller ones, tend to be more into direct marketing. So now they're not dependent upon one commodities market, and they've got some anti-fragility with regards to where their products go. And so just a couple of the benefits of regen ag, if you've not delved into this too much, but we can eat food. I love the saying that you can have your cake and eat it too, because that's really what regen ag is all about. Not only can we get food off of the property, but it cleans the air, it cleans the water, you get healthy animals, healthy humans, increased biodiversity, so it's not farming or nature, it's both. Increased yield, you create pollinator habitat, aquatic habitat, it builds soil, it sequesters carbon, creates microclimate, and seeds clouds. And I'm going to give you one of the most hopeful pieces of news that I've heard in the last 5 years right now. There was a study in a book that I was reading recently that said if all the land from North Dakota, south to the Gulf of Mexico, east to the Mississippi was converted back to perennial grasslands, currently that's grown to wheat, corn, and soy, the US could be carbon neutral overnight without changing any of its behaviors. The ultimate carbon sequestration mechanism is the soil. And yet we continue to try and build tech to compete with technology that's been around for 4 billion years. So it's sitting right in front of us, we just have to activate it. And so I want to talk a little bit about black swans quickly, because I'm going to unpack that word anti-fragile. And basically, when you look at the polycrisis, we can say that there are black swans lurking in all of these different crises, whether it's climate change, soil erosion, gigafamines, nutrient collapse, increased diseases. And so black swans are defined as events that fundamentally change the course of history forever. They're completely unpredictable, and after they occur, everybody says that they predicted them. And so anybody that predicts things is basically a charlatan, because your chances of getting a prediction right are much lower than getting it wrong. And so all we can do is we can break systems down into whether we think they're fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile. So how many people here would say that the financial system how would you classify it? As fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile? Fragile. And what about the food system? Fragile. And what about our energy system? Okay, so once you've defined whether a system you depend upon is fragile, resilient, or anti-fragile, our goal as system scientists is not to figure out what is going to break the system, but the probability of it breaking. And then if that system does break, what are the consequences of it breaking? And then from there, how can we change the design of the system so that when systems break, your situation actually improves? So the easiest example I give to people is, it's crazy that we have 3 days of food on supply at any given moment in North America. So every city in North America has about 3 days of food before they run out. That's insane to me. I mean, if we went back 100 years and told our grandparents that, their jaws would drop. And so a way that you could say that system is fragile, and a really great approach to that is to have a garden or to have a year's supply of food. Both of those things won't cost you any extra. They'll probably save you some money. If you have a garden, your health's actually going to improve. So there's all these things that we can do to improve our situation. And so fragile things, if you're going to send something across the country like a wine glass, a fragile thing is going to say, handle with care. You cannot apply volatility into that system because it'll break. A resilient thing is indifferent to volatility. So you don't have to put any label on a resilient thing because it's probably going to be fine. And the best example of a resilient element in our society is a sidewalk. Because if a sidewalk gets chipped, you can keep walking on it. It still works as a sidewalk. But if a wine glass breaks, you're probably not going to drink wine out of it. And then an anti-fragile thing actually requires volatility to be added into the system. So the human body is a great example of this. If I stop working out or running on a treadmill, my body atrophies. And so my body actually requires impact in order to become better. And when I don't do it, my body becomes worse. And it turns out that ecosystems are the exact same thing. And one of the best examples of this is the beaver, actually, because beavers will go into a system. It looks like they're cutting trees down and making a mess of things. But when a beaver sets up a dam and puts its lodge up, it actually increases the background biodiversity by 28 times. So this is really important, and it's going to come back down to a paradigm shift that I believe we need to make as humans if we're going to continue to coexist on this planet. And so we can see that systems exist on a spectrum of fragile, resilient, and anti-fragile. And as a systems designer, we want to start thinking about how to build human systems that are anti-fragile. And so this includes things like our financial system, our agricultural systems, and the way we set up our civilization. And I think we all just agreed that most of the systems that we depend upon sit over here on the fragile side. And we're all just hoping that we can continue to kick the can down the road so that things don't break down too quickly. And so Regen Ag is also circular. So waste is just an unused resource, and when the needs of a system are not met from within, we pay the price in energy and pollution. And we can kind of see this in our conventional paradigm, because I was just at a hot spring the other day, and everybody was throwing out single-use slippers. And so we just have this, we seem to have no problem with generating negative externalities. We use things once and then we kind of dispose of them. And in a regenerative society, we're going to start having to start thinking about circular systems. And this might just look like a photo with some, like a vineyard and some sheep and some chickens, but there's actually way more going on here. We've got an old, like an intact ecosystem behind it, so that's going to provide us with pollinators and bird habitat. We've got grasses on the ground, so none of the soil is exposed. The fertility is actually coming from these animals that are keeping the grasses down. And so the sheep are providing fertility for the vines so that I don't have to buy external inputs. And then the chickens are coming behind the sheep and they're scratching up the sheep poop. And these birds have got eyes like eagles. And so they're going to break the pest cycle from the sheep. So the sheep don't get sick. And so we actually have a functional ecosystem with these 3 species here, and we could add far, far more. And every single one of these things creates a yield off the waste products of another. And so why aren't we doing this with other systems that we're working on? Jay Harmon said that nature is clean, green, and sustainable, and it can manage to run all of its systems on Earth without destroying itself. This is what we have to model. And so why don't we do this in other domains of our life? So I would argue that it starts with a paradigm shift, and I'm going to quickly describe this, and I think you're going to really resonate with these 3 ideas here, and I'm going to pass it on to Marc. So right now, I would argue that our current paradigm in society is moving from what I call the degenerative paradigm. And this paradigm is based on self-interest. Self-interest meaning, how do I get more stuff for me at any cost? But we're moving out of this paradigm, and we're starting to see cracks of it in when you go onto social media, when you're reading the newspaper, when you're watching television. And we're moving into this sustainable paradigm. And I would describe the sustainable paradigm as a guilt-based paradigm. In fact, you've probably never put words to it, but when I say these words right now, you're gonna agree with me. The underlying message of the sustainable paradigm is that humans are inherently destructive. Lots of you smiling there. And that is because it's like, we're talking about things like footprint, right? And so how do we minimize our footprint? Well, we can't. Newton got this right. He said every action has an equal and opposite reaction. We can't not have a footprint unless we kill ourselves. And so in the same way that the beaver has a footprint, knocks down trees, builds dams, stores water, creates 28 times the background biodiversity, it has a footprint. But its footprint makes things better. And so humans can choose how we use our life energy, how our footprints impact Earth. We can be just as positive as we are negative. And so this moves us into the regenerative paradigm. And so you'll notice on the sustainable paradigm, we're at the bottom of the pyramid of life. We're less than nature. On the degenerative paradigm, we're top of nature. We have complete dominion over the world. And we can do whatever we want with it. And what we're arguing is that we actually need to help humans see that we're part of a community, and we're being really bad neighbors right now. But we have the ability, we have the genetics, we have the science, we have the technology to move towards the regenerative paradigm. And we're arguing that this is enlightened self-interest. So I'm a self-interested person. I'm interested in what's good for me and my kids and my community. But I know that what's best for them is what's best for the ecosystem around me, because we don't have a technology that generates oxygen as well as a tree. We don't, indoor farms that run on hydroponics don't produce nutrient-dense food. And so we need to move to this concept of enlightened self-interest. And so I'm going to pass it over to Marc here.
Thanks, Rob. So as I mentioned earlier, I come from a crypto economics background. And just to be clear there, I'm not a crypto trader, and I'm not really interested in the speculative side of cryptocurrencies. Well, my work has been really around how do we design systems that can incentivize coordination and specific positive action and behavior. And then, I also have a background in city planning and smart cities and renewables, but I never thought about it from a systems thinking perspective before, until I watched, and this is going to sound a bit cliche, The Biggest Little Farm. And what I saw there was basically this family trying to really apply a systems thinking approach using regen ag and permaculture to regenerate land and ecosystems, right, and really create life. And this really clicked for me, right, because the stuff I was trying to do from a digital perspective, right, in the world of bits, there was something equivalent to it in the world of atoms, in the physical world, right, in land management and ecosystem restoration. And so what are we really talking about here? And what do we mean when we say regenerative living? So the first thing we mean here is that farmers are not the only ones responsible to usher us into a regenerative paradigm, right? So Rob mentioned earlier how regen ag is really kind of a move towards more decentralization, right? And it is true, today the system is very centralized. Regen ag allows farmers and land owners and managers to restore their ecosystems, so it will decentralize the system naturally. But then what we're saying here is that moving to regenerative living allow us to even move beyond decentralization towards distributed systems. And what distributed systems do basically is that they basically make everyone responsible, right? They allow the work to be shared across different nodes of the network. And I know I'm talking here from a more technology, digital perspective, but it's the same thing in real life and in the physical world. And so regeneration at the end of the day is everyone's responsibility because we all have a skin in the game in having a healthy system and a healthy ecosystem. If we can figure out how to do this in a profitable way that can generate positive externalities and reinforce positive behaviors, we will all be better off instead of just pushing the responsibility on one stakeholder or even having one stakeholder benefit from the system itself. We're also saying that regen living is a maturing of our species, right? Acknowledging our interdependence with the biosphere. We are part of nature. We live on this earth, and if we destroy Earth, where would we go? I guess some people would argue that maybe by then Elon Musk would have figured out how we can live on Mars. But then the question really is like, does living on Mars really replaces living here on Earth? I don't believe it does. And while going to Mars is really good, but we also have to think about how do we take care of our planet and how do we build healthy regenerative ecosystems. It's also acknowledging that technology is a key feature of our human evolution, right? Technology is really an extension of our thinking capacity and our creativity as a species. And through technology, we were able to evolve over the past, thousands of years. And this is really interesting, right? Because if we go back to the previous slide and we think about the degenerative paradigm and the sustainable paradigm, you can notice today there is a little bit of a back and forth on this topic, right? Like some people believe technology is the answer and we can outgrow basically any problem, right? And we have to just keep growing and growing. And some other people believe that, well, technology is the problem, and we have to stay away from technology and go back to nature. And we think this is a little bit of a false choice. Like, we actually need both. We believe that technology is key as much as nature is key. And we need to figure out, again, how do we build that system that can include both of these really levers that we have to really usher towards a more healthy and regenerative paradigm. And then lastly, it's about moving from this paradigm of growth that we are currently under. So if you think about it today, we live under a paradigm where financial growth is really the main metric that we're trying to optimize for. And this comes at the expense of a lot of other things. And I'm not saying that we do it on purpose, right? It's just the natural way of how systems work. If you focus on just one metric, there's going to be a lot of other metrics that you're going to deprioritize, and this will lead to negative externalities. We also live under this paradigm of we need technology to survive or overcome nature, and Rob spoke about this a little bit earlier. And that's also a bit of the problem, right? Because we actually can use technology to partner with nature. We can use technology in a positive way, not only in a negative way or in a degenerative way. And so what we're talking about here is this concept of regenerative living that can move us from the current paradigm towards a paradigm of growth, but also anti-fragility, right? We still need to grow, we still want to evolve, but we need to figure out how do we make our systems resilient and anti-fragile. And the COVID pandemic was a great test for us, right, as it relates to that. We've seen how fragile our systems are, and it would be a little bit, borderline stupid not to start thinking about how do we build something better. And then the other thing is, again, technology and nature and using them together rather than like positioning them at odds, against each other. So we define regenerative living based on these three main pillars: high tech, high touch, and high nature. When we say high tech, we basically are emphasizing the fact that technology is really a key feature of our humanity. But we also are talking here about designing and using technology in a positive way, in a way that reinforces positive behavior, so that we can actually generate positive externalities rather than negative one. And what I really mean by that is, how do we use technology to focus on not just extracting value, right, financial value or financially growing, but also to regenerate land, to regenerate ecosystems, to make our societies better. And we believe there are solutions there. Like, there's this kind of another false choice, actually, that for us to be able to do that, we have to sacrifice profits. But I think Regen Ag is a good example of, well, you can actually still be profitable and benefit your ecosystem and your community. And it's already proven, right? Like, there's, I don't know how many funds, investment funds exist today that, have the only mandate of actually buying land and regenerating it and showing investors very healthy returns, similar to real estate returns or PE returns, but at the same time, creating positive environmental and societal results. The high touch piece focuses on community, right? We are social animals at the end of the day. A big part of our identity is defined by how we interact with our friends, with our families, with our ecosystems. And what we mean by high touch here is that we need to focus on building meaningful, authentic relationships with the people we care about, our communities, our ecosystem. And if you think about like the current Web 2 model, right, or the current kind of social media ad-based model, this moves us away from that, right? This focuses more on like really getting your attention as fast as they can and as quickly as they can and as cheap as they can so that they can actually sell you more stuff. And I'm not saying this is bad. Obviously, this has benefits, but we're talking about how do we actually complement that with like more meaningful, authentic interactions and really build community rather than just build consumers or user following. And then the last piece is high nature. And we spoke about this a little bit earlier, but really the idea here is that there are so many nature-based solutions today that we could be using, but we're just not, right? Regenerative is one of them. Passive solar greenhouses is another one. Using solar energy, right? Rainwater harvesting systems, having waste, efficient waste management systems. And so how do we actually embed those concepts into our day-to-day life and make it accessible at the level of the local community rather than just rely on the centralized power and energy and food systems that we rely on today? So this is really, like what we're saying here is that regenerative living, which is inspired by Regenag, is really about merging those three concepts, technology, nature, and community, and figuring out how can we design systems that are regenerative and anti-fragile by nature to usher us into this new paradigm. I really love this quote because there's a lot of talk today around carbon capture technology, right? To be able to, reduce or capture our carbon emissions. And we tend to forget that the best technology is actually a tree, right? The tree is the best technology we know of that can actually do that. And so that's a great example of, instead of trying to come up with all sorts of like new technologies, why don't we actually use technology, use AI or robots or even crypto incentives to incentivize planting more trees, right? And this is kind of a good illustration of what we mean by high tech and high nature. So this all is great, right? And you might think it's a little bit utopian. And we're not really saying anything new. Like most of the things we spoke about are really things that already exist today. And so we wanted to give a concrete view of how can we start ushering in that direction. And again, going back to what Rob mentioned, we believe this is more of a societal coordination problem rather than a technological innovation problem. And, in our opinion, we believe that these are the three main intervention points to start, and I'll be going into each one of those in a little bit more detail. So the first one is education, building awareness, educating, and providing support. The second one is measuring, receiving feedback, and adapting. And the last one is coordinating, collaborating, and innovating. And Nelson Mandela said it best, right? Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And if you look at the way we're trying to deal with climate volatility today or climate change, most of the solutions today are top-down, right? And a lot of them are effective and are, delivering some results. But at the same time, we believe that we need to complement this with more bottom-up solutions. And the starting point is really educating people, educating really everyone around ecology and systems thinking, right? Educating people and showing them that you can actually build food systems, water systems, energy systems that generate positive externalities, that are anti-fragile, and that are regenerative. I've been involved in doing something similar from a technology perspective, right? So if you think about the promise of Web3 technology or blockchain, it's really that promise. It's the promise of educating people around data privacy, around owning their own assets, right? Around changing kind of the trust paradigm and the fragility of the financial system. And we're still we still have a long way to go there. But similarly, similar efforts are being done already, and they started in the 70s. Permaculture is a great example of that, from a more nature and kind of energy, food, water perspective. And that's why permaculture is actually called the silent revolution. And a lot of the things that we think should be done have to do with like, how do we actually create this awareness for everyone, right? How do we get people to think about the fact that food is not really cheap or infinite, right? The fact that you're able to buy food for cheap has actually implications, right? Same thing for energy. So how do we remove this like food blindness and energy blindness, which I think a lot of people, are in right now, and I was actually one of them. How do we move from not just focusing on regenerating land and farms, but to actually regenerating pretty much the systems we use on a day-to-day basis, right? Across verticals, supply chains, we spoke about finance. They're pretty much like, probably a lot of industries today are centralized and fragile. So actually, how do we change that? What does this mean? And then one of the things we realized, because we actually do some of this education ourselves, is that when people kind of wake up to the fact of those negative implications that are generated by the current paradigm, they become regen literate, and then their mindset changes, right? And when they realize that, well, there are things that you can do today to change that, and these are impactful things, they basically jump in. And so it's really a transformation that we've seen people go through when they start understanding more where food comes from, where energy comes from, where water comes from, and what are the implications of the current systems, and the fact that the solutions to change that already exist. We're just not adopting them right now for many reasons. One of those reasons is that we don't measure today properly, right? I'm sure you guys have seen this quote before. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And we already measure some stuff in our daily lives, not related to agriculture or nature. I mean, I guess how many people here have a Whoop or a Fitbit or a Garmin or an Apple Watch? I mean, it's pretty impressive, right? When you start tracking those body metrics, you start obsessing over it. You want to really optimize it. You want to sleep well. You want to exercise. You want to eat well, all of that. How many people here have been to a soul cycle class or a theory class or really any cycling class? It's also quite impressive, right? Like when you're in there, you become competitive, right? You want to really be the best, and in a healthy way, right? Like you want to deliver the best results that ultimately benefits you, but also drives this competitive behavior that turns out to be positive. And so imagine we can build the Whoop or the Fitbit for planet Earth. Imagine there is a way we can objectively and transparently measure state changes in ecosystem health, right? What would this create? This will basically encourage or maybe even force people and governments and companies to become more regenerative. It could also start a competition, right? The same way you get into a competitive mode at SoulCycle, it could start a race towards regeneration. And then if we can figure out how to incentivize people to regenerate, and then they can see those results and see those feedback loops and keep doing it, you can then assign value to regeneration. Like one of my dreams, again, coming from a crypto background, is that I would love to get to a point where I can assign a digital asset that represents regenerative value of ecosystem regeneration. And I think we're a bit far from that, but we can get there. And we don't have all the answers. It's a pretty hard problem. But I think the collective effort of everyone can get us there. And by the way, some of this already happens. So I live in New York, and the utility I use is Con Edison. And they do send me every month a report that shows me how much energy I've consumed compared to my neighbors. And this has an interesting feedback loop, right? Because then I start thinking, oh, interesting. Why did I consume this much this month, right? And then I start realizing, oh, maybe I used this, way more than I should have, or maybe my AC was on when I was out, and so on and so on. So it drives behavior change without me even realizing that. It's just like the interesting part of human behavior of seeing data and reacting to it. So education, measurement, these are hard problems, and they require basically everyone to be part of it, right? Like, we cannot really educate people if they don't want to learn about it. We don't have all the answers, so we need more people who are working on these topics to collaborate, to come up with those answers and try to find those answers. And more importantly, we believe that it's really about the process than the outcome, right? Like, right now, we probably have some hypotheses around what we can do, But I think as we collaborate and coordinate, we will probably discover new frontiers and better ways of thinking about how to change things and usher us into this paradigm. And so this quote really speaks to that. When the outcome drives the process, we will only ever go to where we've already been. If process drives outcome, we may not know where we're going, but we will know we want to be there. And this is a great kind of segue to the last intervention point, which is coordinating, collaborating, and innovating. Does anyone here recognize the starship? Good, all right. So this is the Discovery Starship. And the reason I thought it's really relevant here is for two reasons, actually. So if you think about Star Trek, it's really one of the examples, one of the good sci-fi examples of how humans have figured out how to live on Earth, right? And went beyond that to try to explore the universe. And if you really think about it, there's no reason why we cannot get there, right? Again, we already have the solutions, the tools, the frameworks. We just lack the coordination. The other reason Star Trek or this Starship is interesting is because it's actually powered by something called the mycelium drive, right? And so that's a great example of nature and technology being used to explore a new frontier. And I'm not saying mycelium is the answer, obviously, but I'm saying we will discover the equivalent of mycelium if we collaborate and coordinate and innovate more. So if you think about the way human coordination have evolved, the information age and the internet really was a step change, right, in unlocking coordination. So before Facebook, we didn't really have a way to coordinate virtually. Facebook enabled us initially to coordinate with our friends and really kind of our first degree connections. But then from there's kind of a whole industry that started, right? If you think about gaming, and I know a lot of people here think gaming is a subculture, but it's really not. Like there are 3 billion gamers around the world today. You have people who play together virtually, they chat virtually, they become best friends, and they've never met in real life, right? And there are great examples of people like just hanging out on Discord. Discord is basically a chat group that is used in gaming, becoming best friends for 20 years and then meeting for the first time after 20 years, right? And the reason we think Web3 and crypto is interesting here because we believe it's another step change, right? And it's really the starting point. There's a lot of noise today and, definitely a lot of speculation and maybe a lot of negative ways of using crypto. But at the core of it, something like a DAO, which stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization, is really a group chat with a bank account, right? So we're moving from not just meeting online and becoming friends online, we're moving towards pulling in resources online and collectively deciding how to use those resources. So you can imagine you can actually now create a DAO, and these examples already exist. There's a DAO, for example, called Gitcoin that is trying to figure out how do we improve public funding? How do we optimize, this grants industry in a more transparent and effective way? There's another DAO called ViraDAO that focuses on how do we innovate in terms of biomedical research, right? How do we change the current model of how R&D is being done, which is also a little bit broken, but we're not going to get into that right now. There's another DAO called Cabin DAO, which is thinking through how do we actually change the real estate industry, right? Like if you think about real estate today, it's supply first. You buy a land, you build something, and then you just wait for the customers to show up. But you can also change that. You can be cloud first today. If you're able to build, to meet your friends online, to become best friends with them, to pull in your resources, you could ultimately usher into actually buying land and building your own property with your friends and living together, right? And so I'm not saying these are the answers to all our problems, but these are really kind of early examples of the different tools at our disposal to really usher us into this regenerative living paradigm. Why is this important? So Rob earlier spoke about the Metacrisis, and we are in a bit of a race right now, right? We have this growth paradigm that is only optimizing financial growth, but this paradigm today is generating many negative externalities also at an exponential rate, right? If you think about climate, our societal issues, diseases, food, all of that. And so today we are stuck between two options, right? One way to solve this problem is top-down, so more centralization, right? Rely on more government intervention, big companies trying to figure out those solutions. And this needs, these entities need to play a part in this, but just relying on that is not enough, and ultimately might lead to some form of dystopia, which a lot of people are afraid, from, especially when you think about AI. The other option is to just let every single one of us try to figure it out on their own, right? Which ultimately will lead to some form of anarchism or decentralization, I guess, but not really in a positive way, more in the sense of just people hunkering down and doing their own thing, which really removes the coordination and collaboration synergies that, as humans, we can really tap into. And so what we're saying here is that the third option that we believe in is really this distributed global coordination. If we can move towards more bottom-up solutions, if we can move towards more coordination and really empower people to figure out those problems and collaborate to actually work on solving them together, we can move into this regenerative living paradigm, and we can really start addressing this problem head-on. Daniel Schmachtenberger, this should be Daniel actually, it's not David, but Daniel Schmachtenberger talks a lot about this. He talks a lot about the Metacrisis and the fact that we live in a world right now where there is increasing volatility, right? And increasing local and global crises. And the aggregate of these is what he calls the Metacrisis. And he really kind of believes that the reason this is happening is because our economic systems today are just designed to optimize one metric, which is the value metric, the financial value or financial growth. And again, this is generating all these problems. And so we really need to change that. And the same way Regen Ag allows us to usher away from a conventional agriculture paradigm where, again, also growth and profits is the main metric, to a model where it's not just about profits. Profits are important, and we should be profitable, but it's also about environmental, impact and community impact and societal impact and ecosystem impact. And so this is all great, right? Like we spoke about the new paradigm. We spoke about how it's different from the degenerative and sustainable paradigm. We spoke about the main intervention points that we believe we can start with. But we also need to have some end goal here, right? Like we need to know, at least have a hypothesis in terms of like, where are we going with this? And we wanted to share a little bit of our thinking there. Imagine your house is not just a depreciating asset. Imagine your house can generate energy and sell it back to the grid. Imagine your house can grow food, right, through your, garden or greenhouse. Imagine your house can harvest rainwater and secure its own water. I would even say, imagine your house can mine Bitcoin, right, and use the heat from mining to warm up the house or warm up the greenhouse that you're using to grow food, right? And what I'm talking about, again, none of this is new, but I'm talking about integrating those solutions in a way that we can actually make it accessible to everyone and start really thinking about how do we transform the way we live into a more regenerative and anti-fragile way. And by the way, Bitcoin mining, heating up houses and greenhouses also already exists. There are plenty of solutions and plenty of people already doing that. And I'm not saying Bitcoin is the answer, obviously, but I'm saying the idea of using data servers in a circular way is really one of the goals here. And so now imagine that instead of just having one house designed like that, we can design neighborhoods or villages or cities the same way, right? So not just an autonomous regenerative house, but also maybe an urban farm, right, or a community farm, a community greenhouse, places for community to, interact, forest parks, maker spaces. Wouldn't you want to live in something like that? I know I would. But the idea here is to really show that if we start thinking about how to redesign our systems and also redesign our lives in a lot of ways, we can start ushering in this direction. And to prove it and to make it more concrete to you guys, this is already being done. This is a real-life example. This city is a city in Dubai. It's called the Sustainable City. It's sustainable, not regenerative. We think we need to make it regenerative. But it's really 500 residential units, 89 apartments, 11 greenhouses. I think it's 30,000 square feet of urban farm, community spaces, shops, restaurants, cafes. I think they even have a school in there, right? And it's right inside the city of Dubai. And I think this is probably one of the first examples of how we can actually do this. And the power of that example is that once you start showing the world those small islands of coherence, right? You start showing the world that we have alternatives to the way we've been thinking about our systems and our lives. One of the great examples I like to talk about is the fact that in the US, one of the status symbols when you move to the suburbs is really having a lawn, right? Which is like super energy inefficient. But what if the status symbol becomes being biodiverse or being energy efficient or being regenerative? Wouldn't that be better for us and for our community and our ecosystems? So now that we spoke about neighborhoods and cities and villages, and this is a great quote about the small islands of coherence. When a system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence have the capacity to shift the entire system. Imagine now we can add a coordination layer on top of this. Imagine now we have multiple, thousands, maybe millions of villages, cities, neighborhoods all around the world. And imagine these cities can coordinate. They can measure regeneration using, a WOOP or the WOOP for planet Earth. Imagine they can get incentives for doing that. Imagine they're competing, like the same way you guys compete during a soul cycle class or Orange Theory class. Imagine those cities are competing to actually, win the best regenerative city award. This will basically usher us into a new paradigm, right? This will lead us to new models, new networks, new ways of, living and running our economy and collaborating and so on. And this might be utopian, I agree. This is not. But if we can get here, right, this is how bottom-up change can lead to huge impact and paradigm shifts. Again, remember, we started with education, measurement, and coordination. And then we spoke about how we can redesign houses, how we can redesign neighborhoods, or even retrofit neighborhoods. I mean, this by itself, even if we don't get here, is already a huge change to the way our civilization, has been operating, and really kind of a next step of human evolution. I'm going to pass it up to Rob here, and thank you.
So I love this quote because in spite of all the insanity that exists on the planet right now, it's always the times when we're in the most chaos when you can actually intervene in a system and move it in a different direction. But the problem is that when we end up in these chaotic times, it's always the extremists that step in and move society into a direction that we don't want to go. And so this is the call to action for all of us moderates out there that can see what's going on there and to step up to the plate. And we're not saying that farmers don't have a role to play. 37% of the planet is currently farmed right now. But I'm going to leave you with a little statistic, two statistics actually. No, 3 statistics, sorry, they just keep growing. That's the problem with regenerative systems. The first one is that I was asked whether we could grow all of the food that we needed in North America in North American cities by a university student a few years ago. And it turns out there's enough lawn grown in the US to grow everybody a 2,000 calorie diet per day off of one crop for 2 years if we just converted all of the lawns in the United States over to urban farming. So there's no shortage of land, there's no shortage of ability to grow food. And that might seem crazy, but if you've ever heard about the Victory Gardens, this initiative that happened during World War II, where the governments basically came out and said, we don't have enough food to feed everybody, we need people in the United States to actually grow a Victory Garden. It happened in Canada too. 50% of the food for the war effort was grown in backyard gardens within 1 year in Victory Gardens. And so we know it's possible for our society to make rapid shifts, rapid state changes when the need is there. So I'm not actually worried about gigafamines because if we ever got to that point, we could reinvent the Victory Garden. Russia actually has a similar history. The Russian government, when they were the communist government, I guess, was unable to feed their population. And so they actually did something really smart where they opened up peri-urban parts of cities and they gave everybody 1 to 3 acres of land where they could build a small little house and they could garden. Between 50 and 80% of all the food in Russia during the Soviet era was grown in something called the Dasha system. And so there are examples in our history where we have made rapid transitions in order to solve specific problems. And I think that it exists within our civilization to do the same. And so at Fifth World, we offer consulting. We're working on Whoop for Planet Earth, which is known as MRV, and we educate folks. But one of the things that you'll notice in our presentation is we had a lot of quotes from individuals. And that's because we don't have all the answers. This problem is so massive that just relying on governments or corporations to do this is not enough. We need bottom-up solutions. And Marc spoke about this concept of coordination tools, which we're calling the VDAO. And the VDAO is basically a community group that's trying to usher in a new regenerative living paradigm. And we're trying to collect thousands of brains to be part of this in order to work on regenerative problems and coordination across planet Earth. And you can currently join this. There's a manifesto which kind of describes what's going on in the VDAO, and I'll give you a QR code that you can find out more about here, right there. So I think we're at time, but we could probably take 1 or 2 questions if folks have any for us. We're actually at 11. Do I have a couple minutes for questions? No? We're done. Okay, well, we can chat outside if you guys want a little bit more information about Fifth World. Thanks so much.
Thank you.